I mean, I guess there are we take all of the nice say we're ready to nice and search you. I think okay. So like there's the
all right. Welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming to the first edition of #Occupy Valk of spring 2022. I do apologize for the change in dates. Of course, I was sick 2 weeks ago, but I appreciate you all making it out today. Of course, if you haven't been to an Occupy Valk before, these were started after the summer of 2020 when we had a lot of racial violence in the United States, particularly with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And we have used these Occupy Valk sessions as a way to increase awareness of social justice within our different disciplines in the Humanities and Social Sciences department. And actually this semester, we'll be introducing other disciplines into this as well, including people from music and education, I believe. So really appreciate you all coming out. And today, we'll be talking about how geography and social justice can work together, specifically through how space can be contested and in terms of memory. And specifically, we'll be looking at an instance of contestation through space in terms of the Potawatomi Trail of Death, which is a super metal name. By the way, I'm Dr. Bottone, assistant professor here in the Department of Geography. So welcome again. We know that space has a lot of uses, right? Geographers love to talk about space. We recognize, and hopefully you all recognize as non-geographers potentially, that there are many ways we can use space, right? We can use it to sell things, we can use it for education, we can use it as spaces for sports and things like that. One use of space that may go unnoticed by a lot of people, however, is how we use space as a way to impart memory, as a way to memorize, memorialize, and commemorate past events, past people, things that society finds important. As geographers, we recognize that this use of space is actually incredibly important because how we use space to commemorate past events kind of influences how we remember past events and how we think about society and how we understand the country and the spaces we live in. Monuments, right, these big stone statues or metal statues, what have you, are a really important way that spaces have been used and have been created for memory. And in recent years, we have started to recognize that a lot of spaces created for memory in the United States have been particularly problematic, right? Very important instance of this is the Confederate statues debate that's been going on in the United States, right? For instance, this is General Lee in Richmond, Virginia. Right, these statues, largely constructed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so there was a wide range of time in which they were constructed as well, were constructed by people who wanted to impart the values of the Confederate States of America, of the Confederacy, these traders essentially, who broke off from the United States and tried to create a society based on, an economy based on enslavement. These monuments act as a concrete marker for the narrative that they're trying to create. Right? These monuments impart a very definite, a very material way of communicating their narrative. So monuments play an important way of keeping this narrative alive. Because when you walk by these monuments, you may look at it, you may read the inscription on them, and really think to yourself, hey, okay, well, this is what happened. This is what this space is used for. This is how they want us to remember it. Of course, we've realized that these statues are problematic, right? Recognizing and commemorating people who fought against the United States, who broke away, people who enslaved other humans, right? So these statues have become a very, very heated representation of space, how we use space to commemorate our past. And of course, different areas, different regions of the United States have started to take down their Confederate monuments. For instance, New Orleans, Louisiana took down parts of their Confederate monuments. Richmond, Virginia took down parts of their Confederate monument as well. Richmond's Lee statue no longer stands to this day. We've also seen these statues in other spaces of memory in the United States have been used as spaces for countering the memory as well, right? So before the Lee statue was taken down in Virginia, many people went there and protested against the Confederate statues, against the racial violence that was taking place in the United States. And you can see here, for instance, Black, Brown, Unity. There's many other graffitis posted on this statue. People came to this place that was created to memorialize the Confederacy, memorialize people who fought for enslavement. And they, in fact, started to contest that memory, changing the way the space was used and trying to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't, commemorate these people who enslaved other humans. Maybe we should think about how we have risen up against that, how we have changed as a society, and we should also use these spaces to continue to fight for social justice. Statues, of course, are a very large way of commemorating these spaces, but there's other ways spaces can be commemorated through memory as well. Street names, it's a big way, big in terms of creating a lot of feelings, but it's kind of a small way as well because we really don't notice street signs. But street signs are another source of creating space as a memorial space. It's a commemorative space. For instance, many towns and cities across the United States have started changing street names to commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? One of the greatest civil rights activists in the United States history. Of course, as cities have fought to change the street names for Martin Luther King, we also see pushback against that as well, because some people may not want that space to be commemorated in a certain way. They may want that space to represent something else. There's a great instance of this in Kansas City very recently, right? The Kansas City City Council tried to rename the Paseo, one of the oldest streets in Kansas City, to Martin Luther King Boulevard. However, after they had changed the name, the city council voted to do that. 10 months later, there was such an outcry about changing this name that a special election was held, a referendum was held, and the citizens of Kansas City voted to change the name back to the Paseo instead of keeping it as a commemorative space. Ostensibly, this was about residents wanting to remember the history of Kansas City, the Paseo being one of the oldest streets in Kansas City, as well as Paseo residents wanting to not have to deal with address changes. For instance, a lot of businesses were against this because they'd have to reprint material saying what their address was. But at the same time, there are arguments that this was about using this space as commemorating a Black American. People are against that as well. So we see a lot of contestations over space, over how space is used to commemorate and to remember our past, and to remember particularly violent aspects of our past as well, such as the Civil War, such as the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. So with that in mind, how we can use space to commemorate history, but also how we can contest against established memories, I want to take you to Lexington, Missouri. Now, some of you might not know where Lexington, Missouri is. It's about an hour or so away from here, hour and a half or so, on the Missouri River. It's a small town, historically settled by Southern immigrants from the southern United States, such as Tennessee and Virginia. In fact, it's in the region of Missouri that's often called Little Dixie because of the Southern heritage in the area. I went here in June of last year because I wanted to see a battlefield. I'm a history nerd. So my wife and I took a trip out to see the Battle of Lexington State Historic Site because this was one of the first battles in the state of Missouri in the Civil War. Of course, also, I love tourism. I love everything like that. So before we went, I started reading the brochures of Lexington. I started looking at the website. And they also were touting that they had this statue that was here, right? This statue that had been built and commemorated, or built to commemorate specifically pioneers who had come to this area in the early 1800s. And specifically to commemorate pioneer mothers, women who had made the trek across the United States to settle the Western frontier. This statue is called the Madonna of the Trail. It was built in 1929 and specifically funded by the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, one of the most famous women organizations in the United States. So they had touted this monument in their brochure, so I had to go see it as well, of course. So I got my picture in front of it, and I started reading a little bit more into it because I had never heard of this statue before. I've never heard of the Madonna of the Trail, and I was really intrigued by this, about what it represents as well. And when you look into what the Madonna of the Trail really represents and what narratives it's trying to espouse, right? It's about commemorating people who traveled to the Western United States, about commemorating people who settled the wild frontier, right? But if we dig a little deeper into that idea, thinking about who this is commemorating and the narratives it's commemorating, we kind of run into a little troublesome nugget. And that is this idea we call settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a form of settlement, basically in which a new society or settlers move into an area and they develop a new society through the replacement of the indigenous population. Essentially what happened in the United States, right? We had indigenous peoples, American Indians living here for centuries before. They had their own societies, their own territories, their own nations built up and created. And then 1607, Jamestown was founded by English settlers. They came and constructed a new society. And all through this time, of course, they were forcing American Indians off their native lands, off their territories, and encroaching further and further into the Western United States. This is settler colonialism, creating a new society through the removal, through the replacement of the indigenous population. I just want to make another distinction here that this is different from regular colonialism, what we just call colonialism. Colonialism itself is where a dominant power comes and establishes a foothold in another country and says, you know, hey, we are going to use this as kind of a foothold here. We're going to get some gold. We're going to get some supplies, some resources from this area. But you will still get that. You, the natives of the land, will still get to keep doing what you're doing. We're just going to extract everything. And all the decisions are made from the home country, right? Settler colonialism, on the other hand, as I said, is the establishment of a whole new society, right? White settlers came in from Europe, established the United States, broke away from England, and set up a whole new society. That is the difference here. Lorenzo Veracini, a famous settler colonial scholar, once made the distinction between colonialism and settler colonialism as same as the distinction between a bacteria and a virus. Whereas a bacteria will just come in and, oh gosh, I shouldn't have done this because now I forgot which one was which.
Bacteria can reproduce all by themselves. The viruses that eat your cells.
Thank you. There we go. Yes, our resident scholar of science history. Thank you so much. Yeah, so the virus needs the cells to reproduce. They're the ones who, this would be colonialism because they need the native population in the colony to reproduce, to survive and keep that colony going. However, the bacteria, it can live by itself, right? It comes into your body, establishes a bacterial, what we would call a bacterial colony, but it's living on its own. It's setting up a new society. So for you STEM majors that are in here, that's another good way of thinking of this. So settler colonialism is essentially how the United States was founded. Canada is another settler colonial society, Argentina, Australia, South Africa. There's many of these settler colonial societies around the world today. One thing that's super important to creating and maintaining these settler societies is the erasure of the indigenous population from the landscape, both in terms of actually removing the indigenous population, so as the settler can control the territory, and they can actually come in and say, hey, this is ours now. We are going to establish our society here. They actually have to remove the indigenous population from these territories. So a lot of times we see violence in the histories of these societies as they fight to control these territories and say, hey, this is really ours. It's not yours. It's our settler society territory. However, we also see the removal of native memory and native cultural landscapes from the spaces as well. If we remove aspects of native memory, then there's nothing there to say that this was previously indigenous territory. To say that, hey, actually, you know, this land was taken from the indigenous populations. This land was not previously ours, because settler societies thrive off this idea that they were the first ones here, that this society was the first ever here. And this idea, this erasure of indigenous population, of indigenous memory, it has to keep on occurring. Patrick Wolf, famous settler colonial scholar as well, said that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. What that means is that it didn't just happen once, right? It wasn't just the removal of the indigenous population in 1607, but it keeps occurring over and over. It is a structure that has to be maintained. The indigenous population has to keep being removed. Indigenous memory has to keep being removed to ensure that the settler colonial society survives, to ensure that its integrity stays intact. So settler colonialism has to be maintained. And as we are currently, and always have been, a settler colonial society, this is occurring in the United States. We are maintaining settler colonialism through many different structures, through the government structures, through economic structures, through social structures. And one way this is being maintained as well is through memory. We are commemorating spaces of settler colonialism in the United States to maintain this idea that white settlers, white Americans were the first ones here. They were the ones to come in and establish a society out of nothing. And the Daughters of the American Revolution are really bad about this. They are one of the largest producers of settler colonial spaces in the United States. For one instance, there's a state park in Tennessee. It's called Sycamore Shoals State Park. And I went there a few years ago, and I haven't a picture of it out of here, but there's a plaque inside the visitor center, and it literally says that these settlers came here into naked wilderness and set up a society out of nothing. Like, that's what it says. So the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, are very into promoting the idea that white Americans were the first here, the first to establish a society, the first to establish quote unquote civilization. When in fact, we know from studying indigenous history, we know from studying indigenous cultural futures and presents that still exist today, that white Americans were in fact not the first ones here. And the Madonna of the Trail is all about this as well, maintaining the idea that specifically white women came through here, they muscled through the wilderness and were able to set up a society for the future of their children, for the future of white America. So that is what this space is all about. This monument is setting up a space saying that, hey, this is a white American space, this is a settler space. We are commemorating that white Americans were the first ones here. But if you notice, in the background of the Madonna of the Trail monument, there's a little sign poking out. A little sign back here, right? So when I came here, when I went to Lexington in June of 2021, I got curious about this, because this was not in any tourist brochures. This was not on the Lexington City website or anything like that. So I got curious, walked over to the sign, and it says Potawatomi Trail of Death, Regional Historic Trail, 1838, Indiana to Kansas. And this really intrigued me because I had never heard of the Potawatomi Trail of Death before. Also, again, it's just a reading metal name. So right below this sign is a boulder right here. And this boulder has a plaque on it saying Trail of Death historic marker on October 8th, 26, 1838. 800 Potawatomi Indians being forcibly removed from Indiana camped on the riverbank opposite Lexington. They ferried the Missouri River on October 27th and marched on to northeast Kansas. This is telling a little bit something different than what the Madonna of the Trail monument is telling us. It's telling us a little bit more about the history of the location, about who was here before and who isn't here now. So I went home and I started investigating the Potawatomi Trail of Death. And I learned that it was a forced removal of American Indians from northeast Indiana in September of 1838. What happened was, throughout all of American history as well, white American settlers had been signing quasi-legal treaties with American Indians, saying, hey, we'll give you some rights if you give us a little bit of that land. And over time, these treaties would be broken because white American settlers had more military power, had more political power as well, saying that, we'll just break these treaties. The American Indians, they really can't do anything about it. So over time, more and more land was being taken, more and more treaties were being signed, and more land was being taken. And eventually we end up in Indiana in 1838, when 2 years before a treaty had been signed, or supposedly signed by a band of Potawatomi Indians. The Potawatomi are a smallest band of American Indians. They originally came from the Great Lakes region, the northern Great Lakes region of Canada and the United States. Eventually, they moved down in the 1600s into areas of the southern Great Lakes around what would now today be northeastern and northwestern Indiana. And they had been living there for several hundred years when white American settlers started to move into Indiana, realizing that Indiana is really good farmland. Really good farmland, really good for growing crops. And of course, this meant that white American settlers really wanted this land as well. So in the 1830s, a series of treaties were signed with the Potawatomi Indians, or supposedly with the Potawatomi Indians, saying that they would give up their rights to the land in northeastern Indiana, and in return would move to reservation lands in eastern Kansas. Now I keep saying supposedly, because one Potawatomi chief, his name is Menominee, he said he never ever signed this treaty. He maintained till the day he died that he never signed this treaty. However, the US government said he did, and that his band of Indians were then robustly required to leave to the reservations of northeastern Kansas or eastern Kansas. Menominee refused to do so and maintained his campsites, his villages in northeastern Indiana until Governor David Wallace of Indiana. Unfortunately, David Wallace, because David Wallace is the best character in The Office, by the way. Shares the same name, unfortunately. Anyway, David Wallace of Indiana ordered militiamen to go and round up Menominee's Potawatomi tribe, which they did very forcibly under the threat of violence. And his band of Indians, numbering somewhere around 800 or so, were moved to a camp on Twin Lakes, Indiana. And after spending several days in a very cramped encampment, were forcibly marched from northeastern Indiana into eastern Kansas. This trip took somewhere around 2 months. I believe they left September 10th and arrived in eastern Kansas in November 4th. So it took over a couple months. The trip was very long. It was about 660 miles. Both men, women, and children were forced to make the march. They did not have any horses or anything like that to carry them. Only the militiamen were allowed to have horses. And there was a lot of lack of food and water, specifically drier areas of the American prairie. Over the trip, somewhere around 40 Potawatomi Indians died. It is not known exactly how many because record keeping was, pretty shoddy in this time period, specifically when it came to American Indians. It is believed that most of these 40 or so Potawatomi were women and children. Most died of either dehydration or of disease, specifically typhus, as a result of the horrid conditions that they were forced to travel on. And of course, I say forced because they were marched along on this route by militiamen carrying guns on horses, carrying swords as well. So they were forced to make this trek from northeastern Indiana to eastern Kansas. And unfortunately, when they got to eastern Kansas, this was a completely unknown territory to them. They were not prepared for the cold weather that eastern Kansas has. And it is believed that many more Potawatomi unfortunately died as a result of their rapid exposure to the very cold winter of eastern Kansas. Unfortunately, records again, very shoddy as a result of this. But the Potawatomi were then on a reservation in eastern Kansas as a result. Over time, there were some movements to commemorate or to remember this caravan of Indians, as it has come to be called. The first usage of the Trail of Death moniker is believed to have occurred in 1899 when an Indian historian was writing about their Potawatomi removal when he gave the name Trail of Death. Of course, this name comes from the fact that 40 or so women and children mostly died on this trek. It's a little bit scarier sounding than the Trail of Tears. Not as many proportionally died as on the Trail of Tears. Of course, the famous Cherokee Indian removal from the southeastern United States. But nonetheless, this is a very significant moment in the Potawatomi history, of course, and a very sincere and a very tragic moment in their history as well. So the Trail of Death name stuck as a result, trying to commemorate those who died on this trek from northeastern Indiana. In 1909, the state of Indiana actually erected a monument to Chief Menominee. This is Chief Menominee here. It is the first monument in U.S. history to be paid for by a state legislature and to commemorate a Native American. You may think this goes a little bit in contrast to what you're saying about settler colonial erasure of American Indian history. However, at the time, there was a lot of movement to remember the American Indian as a lost civilization. People were very sad about specifically the closing of the American frontier in the 1890s. In 1890s, it was said that the American frontier was closed and that there was nowhere left to settle anymore. There were no new places to go and settle in. And people were very nostalgic about this fact that people were trying to remember the olden days, 20 years before of the closing of the frontier. And the American Indian really represented this frontier as well. So there was a big push to remember the closing of the frontier through Native American imagery. And this included Chief Menominee in northeastern Indiana. So even though it is a monument to an American Indian, it also still goes into this idea that they're remembering the settlement of the United States. Specifically, they're remembering, hey, there were Indians here, but we, kind of destroyed them all. But still, it's about the memory of the American frontier. In 1949, there was also a historic marker put up in Twin Lakes or near Twin Lakes, Indiana. Again, though, this was a very small memorial to the Trail of Death and those 850 or so Potawatomi Indians who were forced to go on this march. And the language in here is not as forceful as some would like it. So until the 1980s, this was all that existed to commemorate the Trail of Death. Enter Shirley Willard. Shirley Willard still is a member of the Fulton County, Indiana Historical Society. And she came across the story of the Potawatomi Indians and their Trail of Death in the 1980s and said, hey, something needs to be done about this. Something needs to be done to remember what these people went through, what the Potawatomi Nation went through. So she founded what became known as the American Indian, the Indian Awareness Center, which was part of the Fulton County Historical Society, in conjunction with the Potawatomi Indians. So this was done alongside the Potawatomi tribe, which was now actually in Oklahoma, because they actually moved from Kansas to Oklahoma later on. In 2005, they also specifically changed the name from the Indian Awareness Center to the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association. So specifically keying on that name and that their mission is to remember the Potawatomi Trail of Death. Part of their mission is to go out and mark the locations where the Trail of Death went through. Their goal is, and was because they completed it, was to mark the location of every campsite, every location where the caravan, the forced removal of American Indians from northeastern Indiana slept, every campsite where they may have spent a day or two. And on these markers, they would say what happened. They would include diary entries from people who went along on the Trail of Death. And it was their hopes, this is the vision statement from the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association. It is their hope that, quote, doing this can help prevent anything like this from ever happening again. It can help the public to realize what was done to the American Indians and what the true history is. Really coming at that settler colonial narrative, saying that, hey, American Indians were here. American Indians were here, and that we were forcibly removed from this landscape. Injustice was done against us. The current landscape does not reflect this. It's very white settler associated, very white settler centric. And something needs to be done to remember this historical event, to remember the tragedy that befell the Potawatomi tribe of Indiana. So since 1988, the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association has been working to use space to change the memory of American society. To say, hey, this isn't just a space where white Americans came in and settled. It's also a space where American Indians used to live. A space where American Indians had society, had a territory, had a nation, but something happened, and it was white settlement. White settlers came in here, forcibly removed us, many of which, and some of which died along the way during this forcible removal, and moved us to a location that was entirely not ours. So the Trail of Death Association has put out 78 markers from northeastern Indiana to eastern Kansas, marking the location of each of the campsites. They also were successful in getting this trail marked as a regional historic trail, essentially saying that it will be put into government documents that this exists, that it will be mentioned in tourism ads and things like that, and that there's also will be official road signs on the side of the road as well. Because of course, if you put a sign on the side of the road, it's going to get taken down. So they had to be able to do that. This is the symbol of the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association. It represents a Potawatomi family as they are forcibly removed and traveling to eastern Kansas. And they are followed by a red-tailed hawk, which is vitally important to the people of the Potawatomi Indians, Potawatomi Nation. So you'll see this on the historic regional historic trail signs as well. And if you remember back to the Lexington slide, that was what was on that road sign. So it's out there. Of course, the Trail of Death runs through Missouri. So we actually have a large portion of the Trail of Death running through Missouri. And this was the last leg of the journey before they entered eastern Kansas. There are 21 markers in the state of Missouri, stretching from West Quincy all the way over here on the banks of the Mississippi River to Grandview, right to the east of the Kansas border. It took about a month for the Potawatomi Indians to travel through Missouri, and this was done mostly in the month of October. There was a lot of cold weather. There are diary entries talking about frost on the ground. There's diary entries talking about ice they had to cross. So this was a particularly harrowing part of the journey as well. But the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association has worked to commemorate and to use space to say, hey, you know, people were here, and that there was a forced removal of these people. So I went along the Trail of Death in July of 2021 to understand how space was being used to commemorate and being used to memorialize this tragic event in American history. I want to take you along this trail to give you some examples of how space is being used to specifically combat settler colonialism and the white-centric spaces that we see. Starting in eastern Missouri, this is a very rural part of Missouri. There's not many towns, there's a few towns. And these towns really don't have a lot of statues or anything like that. And a lot of times the encampments took place in very rural areas. So the markers here are in rather rural areas. But still, these markers are reclaiming space. Space that has been given over to farmland, space that has been given over to white ownership. These markers are still reclaiming space and reclaiming the idea that, hey, American Indians were here. American Indians were here and they were forcibly removed, that there was essentially a genocide against these peoples that was perpetrated against them. So these markers, even if they are in rural areas, such as in West Quincy, Missouri, this is in the back of a gas station. This is in Pleasant Springs, and this is literally in the middle of nowhere. This is in Palmyra, right next to a Hardee's, so it's not in the middle of nowhere, but it's right in a very rural area. Despite these being in very rural locations, they're reclaiming space and saying, hey, American Indians were here. And then we get to Paris, because, you know, we'll always have Paris. Paris, Missouri is the county seat of Monroe County in eastern Missouri. And this is where I first began to realize that space was actually being used to specifically combat settler memory. Because the Potawatomi marker for the Trail of Death is located on the county courthouse grounds of Monroe County. Specifically, we have the courthouse right here. This is where we see the marker. You also notice, though, that there's two markers here. On the left side, we have a marker to Ezra Fox, the first white settler in Monroe County, Missouri. On the other side of the plant, we have our Potawatomi Trail of Death marker. And this is where I realized that people were making conscious decisions to use space to combat settler colonialism, to combat the idea that white Americans were the first ones here, right? This says this is the first white settler in Monroe County. Makes no mention that there were other people here before, right? Just saying, hey, white settlers came here. That's history, right? Well, this was erected in 1939. That marker was erected in 1988. For 50 or so years, the only narrative being espoused in Monroe County on the grounds, on the space of this county courthouse where that white settlers were here. But then the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association came along, said, hey, you know, the Potawatomi Trail of Death came through here. Potawatomi Indians were forcibly marched to this location. We need to commemorate that. We need to use this space to say that white settlers weren't the first ones here. And in fact, white settlers were the ones who drove off the original inhabitants. So this marker, specifically being placed on the other side of this Ezra Fox marker, is being used to directly combat this narrative and to have people who come and visit the space realize that there's a really tense history going on here. There's a really complex nature to our American history. Huntsville, Missouri, to the east, to the west, I always get east and west mixed up. Huntsville, Missouri, to the west of Monroe County. Once again, we have a Trail of Death marker. This is again on the Huntsville City courthouse, or the Huntsville City Hall. Huntsville is a super small town, though, so it doesn't look like much. But we have our Trail of Death marker, and in the background of this, there's a tree. And in front of this tree, there's a sign that says, planted to honor the memory of the quote-unquote old settlers that were here past before. Old settlers is a term used to refer to white settlers that were here before. Specifically, old settler societies were set up in the late 1800s to commemorate those who first settled areas of the United States. This is actually where the Daughters of the American Revolution got their idea of founding from, because these old settler societies were particularly created for white men to commemorate as a way of being nostalgic for the days in which they came and settled these areas. So the old settlers espoused the same ideas, that they were the first ones here, that they created civilization from the wilderness. And this tree was planted to commemorate those old settlers in 1990. And in 1997, 7 years later, the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association came along and said, hey, this looks like a good spot for our marker. Looks like a good spot to combat this memory and to use this space specifically to make people reflect on the history of the United States. Moving westward, we get to Keepsville. This is one of my favorites. Keepsville is, again, a small town, but again was an encampment along the Potawatomi Trail of Death. When you get to the city square, you'll see this. This is the marker right here. It's a small stone, and there's a monument in the background. Behind the Trail of Death marker is a monument to Sterling Price. Anybody know who Sterling Price is? He was a Confederate general in the Civil War. Specifically, he was a Confederate general in the Civil War who fled to Mexico because he did not want to surrender to the United States and tried to establish a Confederate colony in Mexico. So he himself was a settler. And we again see that this space is being used to combat the idea of white settler colonialism, specifically Confederate settler colonialism, which was very bad all around. But again, using space to combat that idea. Brunswick, Missouri. By the way, Brunswick, Missouri has the world's largest pecan in it. Though it's actually the second largest pecan because the world's largest pecan is in Texas.
Yes, it is.
Seguin, Texas. We have our marker right on the banks of the Missouri. Sorry, this is the Grand River, not the Missouri. The Grand River, right, Trail of Death marker. But when you turn around, if you're facing this way, and you turn this way, you'll see that it's right next to Lewis and Clark campsite and a sign talking about Lewis and Clark. Of course, Lewis and Clark are some of the most famous white settlers out there, going through the Old West and trying to establish fort sites and trying to establish places that could be used for white settlers. So again, we see trying to combat that narrative. We come to DeWitt. Again, we find a Daughters of the American Revolution marker, specifically for a French fort that was located here. We get to Wellington, Missouri, another Daughters of the American Revolution marker. Here's our Trail of Death marker. Right next to it is a marker dedicated to the Santa Fe Trail. The Daughters of the American Revolution were very interested in commemorating historic trails in the United States, specifically trails that white settler women traveled on. And they were the ones who really established the idea of the Santa Fe Trail and the Oregon Trail and the California Trail. And they're the reason why we have all these signs around Kansas City and other areas of Western Missouri designating these trails, because they really pushed for the idea that these people were vitally important to remembering the history of the United States. But again, we see the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association combating this idea, saying that, yeah, these people did settle here, but they did it on the backs of many dead Potawatomi Indians. We get to Independence, Missouri, right? Kind of close to home here. You also notice that the background changes because when my wife and I went on this trip, we did it in one day. And then we got really tired when we got to Jackson County, Missouri, so we just gave up. And then I went out back in January and got the last 4 markers. So it was very green and verdant in the last several pictures, and you'll see snow here. That's why there's snow here. But we get to Independence, Missouri. Again, we have our Trail of Death marker. And the Trail of Death marker was placed on the site of what was known as the Pioneer Spring. And there's a historic marker there to the Pioneer Spring detailing what it was. It was a place for pioneers, but also Indians, to come and get water on the trails. When this Trail of Death marker was put in place, there was also a Pioneer Cabin Museum there. A cabin museum that was dedicated to telling the history of those settlers who settled Independence, Missouri. And this marker was set up right across from that cabin. Again, to combat that narrative saying, hey, this space was Indian space as well. However, very recently, in the last year or so, the cabin has been moved. It is now on the grounds of the National Frontier Trails Museum, which is still in Independence. It's just not in the same location anymore. So we have this big bare space here, which also means that less people will come and see this marker because people were coming to see the Pioneer Cabin, but less people will come to this location and see the marker as a result of the cabin now no longer being there. Still in the location where that marker is, it's also a community center, and Independence has done a really good job here of actually creating a sculpture garden that includes both a white woman settler, but also an American Indian man, saying that both people shared this space. And they're using these statues to give the impression that the space was here for both people. However, we still see, of course, settler colonial narratives being put in place, being enforced in these monuments, being enforced by these monuments. And that's the point here, is that space can be used to change the way we think. Monuments that are taking up space can push certain narratives, can be used to get us thinking about certain things. And if they're the only monuments that exist, if they're the only narratives that are being pushed, then we may not realize exactly how our country was founded, exactly how the history went down. So it's important to note that space can be used to fight against these narratives as well. We can resist these dominant narratives, such as settler colonialism. And the Potawatomi Trail of Death Association is a great example of this, how space can be used to combat these narratives and try to remember how our country was founded and who founded our country and who no longer exists in these spaces as a result of our country's founding. All right. Thank you very much.